Today, I'm replacing a broken torsion spring. This garage only had one spring, and you'll see that a lot. I prefer to use two springs. It helps to keep everything locked and centered. When you have one spring, your door is moving slightly one way or the other every time it goes up and down between 1 inch and 2 inches, and that wears things out faster. If you have two springs, it locks it in one position and it goes up and down the way it should. Typically when you're changing a torsion spring, this one was already broke, but if there was two, you would need to unwind the second side. If you're not versed in that, I would not suggest doing it unless you talk to someone that can explain it to you, and I'm not going to do it right now. But your two center bolts there are almost always 9/16, and you would remove them, and then you would loosen your 7/16. It's actually a 3/8, but I use a 7/16. It's just easier for me to get on there when I'm under pressure. But these two set screws here, you would loosen those, and then you will start to slide everything to whichever side the spring is on. Slide it off down to this side. And up there, I've already removed the drum. Again, I use a 7/16. There's two set screws on it to loosen it. And then there is generally one or two 9/16 screws or nuts that will hold your end bearing on, and a 7/16 head lag that goes into the wall. And that's not always there either. It should be. It's not quite as important if you have two bolts at the bottom, but if you have one, you need that top lag. So anyway, after you would remove the end bearing, you would remove your drum right there, and then you slide your spring parts off of that side completely. Whether or not you were replacing one spring or two, the springs on most doors, if the cables go to the back side of the drums when they go up from the bottom, then your springs will wind towards the front, or towards the garage door. So these are going to wind directly. I will wind them clockwise from this side. And if you look at the other side, the tip of it, if you can see it in that picture, is right there somewhere. Okay, right there. And this one is going to wind counterclockwise. It's on the other side. But that's important to make sure that you have them the right way. If your cables went on the front sides of the drums, your springs would wind backwards. So you would need that to point towards you. So I will always put both springs on one side if possible. Sometimes you don't have a split center support, so you have to remove the center support or take both springs off each end, and I usually just remove the center support and go to one side. That side down there has already been set. The drum's where it needs to be, so I usually just try not to mess with that. It's also important to have a center bearing. See that little black sleeve there? It's either and it doesn't always necessarily have to be a bearing, but it needs something to center the bar in the spring, or your spring will flop, or your bar will flop around in there as the spring winds and unwinds when the door goes up and down, and will eventually eat the rod in half. It may take a while, but it will happen. So anyway, we slide the springs on from this one side, then we go back to this side and rebuild everything in the opposite way that we took it apart. So I'll put the drum on first, then the end bearing. Everything is back together. This lighting in here sucks. Sorry guys. There's my two 9/16 bolts that I put on, and my 7/16 lag back there against the wall. Usually this bracket goes to the inside of, this is called your horizontal angle. You can see here it's on the inside. And if you have two springs, you always slide your drums clear to the outside. If you have one spring, you would gap one of these drums on the opposite side of the bar as the spring, because again, like I explained earlier, your door is going to go back and forth as it goes up, and if it's right against that drum, it's going to be trying to shove that bearing over, and you're either going to get a lot of wear, or the door is going to be really, really difficult to raise. Now we will slide the springs over to the middle, bolt everything back up in the middle. You want to make sure that your bar is level. Just throw you a little bullet level on that bar right there. After you've done this a while, I promise you, you can just see it. I did not have to use a level on this. When I'm installing a new one, I always use a level, but I got a pretty good eye. Been doing this since 2005. You just want to make sure, though, you might have to raise your bar a little bit. You got your center bearing in there. That's what's going to, keep everything nice and level and straight. You want them nice and secure, too. Then you're going to look to make sure the door is centered. And on this side, if you look in that gap, I can actually see a little bit of the rubber molding on the outside of the door through that gap. I'll walk to the other side, and I'll look and see it's a lot tighter there, and you don't see any of that rubber on the outside. So the door needs to go slightly to the left. And I've got a special way of doing that, and I don't think I can show it because I don't have my tripod, but these doors are heavy, but it is possible to kind of lift it and slide at the same time, and it will move. I've got it moved over as far as I can to the left with the way that it's installed. And also one thing that you'll need to look out for is if you can see down here, you're starting to see a light gap. That's because the opening is not square anymore. It has shifted a little bit. So you have to kind of compensate to make sure that the entire door edge is covered on the outside. So I centered it back up. Now I'm going to check it for level. And you will want to check the door in several different places because these thin metal pieces bend. And this door is pretty darn level. You'll come up here and you'll start your cable in that little slot. You'll wind, this is the side that I didn't mess with, so I know that the drum is right where it needs to be. I put the cable on the back side, I wind it around. You make sure that the cable isn't grabbing on anything. A lot of times the cable will go to the outside of the door, it'll wrap up over the edge. You gotta make sure that's not happening. And then you will get it as tight as you can, pulling towards you. That would be counterclockwise, I guess. And you'll lock some vice grips on there to keep tension on that cable while we go set the other side. And again, this is all the way right up against the drum because we have 2 springs. Okay, so again, we put the drum or the cable in the slot on the drum. We wind from the back side or over the back. So your cable's against the wall. We shove the drum as far as we can out to the bearing, and you can see there, that's how far that it was spaced to be able to slide back and forth with a single spring. And now we have 2 springs on it. And it looks like I'm really, really close to where the old set screw used to be. So the door may have been out of level a little bit before, and now we've got it back in where it needs to be. Who knows, there could have been a little settling. Not something that I'm going to be totally concerned with as long as the door works properly when it goes up and down. So let's go wind some springs. One thing that you should always have when winding some springs or working on a garage door in general is gloves and a good set of tempered steel winding bars. I know a lot of people try to get away with using different things, rebar, cut off, ratchet extensions and stuff like that, and that's really, really dangerous. The cones in these things are made of aluminum, and believe it or not, man, I mean, you can see the bottom of that's hollow. That is, it can so easily break off there if it's marred. It looks like somebody may have tried to wind this with something that shouldn't have. Anyway, you can see the markings in there. This one here looks pretty smooth on this side. Maybe a little bit of damage in there, but if that thing breaks while you're winding, dude, you're in for a world of hurt. So these bars, these ones are actually a little more expensive because I got the octagon ones. They won't roll away from me. But typically winding bars are about $10, man, and it can save your life pretty much, so get some. Now the winding will depend, again, how the door is set up, but this is just a standard setup here. We've got 400 drums, looks like a 12 to a 15-inch radius over there. The springs are on the way that they're supposed to, the cables are on the way that they're supposed to, and what you do when you are winding is you're going to pull towards you, 1/4 turn at a time, and I would stick my next bar, which I can't do with one hand here, in that next hole, and then I would pull the top bar out and do that over and over again. And the way that it determines how many winds, you get is determined by the drums and the radius that I was talking about. The radius is the distance that it takes for the door to go from vertical to horizontal. And you can see the split there in the track, and that is probably more like a 15-inch radius. That drum is called a 400 drum, which is your standard drum. A 400 drum is exactly 1 foot around that drum. So a 7-foot door needs to go around that drum 7 times, which means we need to wind the spring 7 full turns. And you can see the line there starting. I have 9 quarter turns. A lot of times you have to go by quarters. You can't get full turns. It's impossible. You either go by quarters or halves. You can see it's a solid line on that spring over there. And as you turn it, that spring will go around and around. So I will wind this thing 28 quarter turns and 1 extra quarter. So 29 quarter turns to lift the door 7 feet. And that extra quarter turn will make sure that there's still a little bit of tension on those cables when the door is all the way up. I hope you guys can see this. I wanted to show you a little bit of how the springs get wound. Got my camera sitting on a box in the corner. Probably it'll fall off there. We've got the other side wound. I usually will start off twisting it a couple quarters by hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it holds tension at that point. 8 quarters is 2 full winds. $28, $29. Right there is when the octagon bars are good. The round ones used to roll off my lap. I usually tighten these up by hand as much as I can. Sometimes they're a little stiff from shipping. And then you're going to pull the bar off the garage door just a little bit so it'll be easier for you to get out of there and not be crushed up against the door. Tighten these. These are 3/8 again, but I use a 7/16 wrench that just fits on there easier. I'm not trying to fight it. Fit is a relative term. The guy that trained me showed me that. That's why I do it that way. So after you got both them tight, you can kind of test your door by lifting it with the bar and seeing if it stays. I don't know if you guys can see the gap. Probably not. The bottom door is staying where it's supposed to. That's a good indication that it's balanced properly. And a properly balanced door will always stay exactly where you stop it. It won't try to go up on its own. It will not fall. And a lot of times people think you can just wind the springs or take winds off. Well, that's not true. If I've got exactly 7 foot of winds on there and we take some off, that door is not going to go up 7 feet. And when you put an opener on it, it's going to pull that door up that last foot, but your cables are going to pop off. Or if you've overwound it to try to get a door to come off the ground, the opener is going to have to work twice as hard to push the door down. So it really needs to have the proper springs. With the door in the full up position, you want to check and make sure that both your cables on both sides still have tension on them. If one cable is loose, more than likely your tracks haven't been leveled to the door. And one track will need to be raised or lowered, possibly depending on if they're already on the ground or not. But you check both sides and they should be even and have tension on them. That way you know when the door starts to come down, it's not going to pop this cable off of the drum. And the final test is always making sure that the door goes up and down properly with as little as noise as you can expect for the systems that you're given. And that door needs to go down just a little bit more with some adjusting, which is no big deal. I've already had it up, so I know that it goes up far enough, but I still like to run it through the cycle. Normally you would also lubricate all of the hinge points, the rollers, and a little bit on the operator bar. This door is very well oiled, so I'm not going to worry about that. I clean up all my stuff, I locked the door, and I'm on my way to the next one.